As much as I love to embrace joy, this work will break your heart and rebuild it over and over again. But it is with a fierce optimism that I know that we are working towards change, and every step is one step closer to change. All of the work that we do leads towards justice, and I want to make sure that I'm fueled for that work ahead. And so keeping my joy and not letting the world take that away, because they don't want us to lead with joy. Whoever they is, the big nefarious science fiction, they don't want us to have joy, and they will try to take that away at every moment. But I'm able to do this work because I fundamentally believe that we should have communities that are built and centered around joy, kind of like that human design.
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Audience, today's conversation is going to inspire you and introduce you to the visible voice that is Rhode Island State Senator Tiara Mack. Tiara is Democratic member of the Rhode Island State Senate. She represents District 6, comprised of 20,000 constituents. She studied public health after considering German, neuroscience, and other academic pursuits at Brown University. She's an educator, including, not limited to, mathematics and sexual education. She's an award-winning rugby player, crochets, identifies as a rabbit mom, and she loves books, just like me. She's a history maker. In 2021, with 60% of the vote, Senator Mack defeated the 30-year incumbent Senator Harold Metz in the Democratic primary. Senator Mack, Tiara, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
Thanks for having me, Resa.
So, 2020, you were campaigning. Quote, "I'm running to make Rhode Island the best place it can possibly be. Not just for the rich or the privileged, instead for everyone, including people who look like me. Also, I don't hide who I am. I don't assimilate to white supremacy. I lead with joy. I lead with laughter. And I lead with a fierce commitment to protecting the most marginalized communities through my campaign."
Yes, I think one of the things about being in office, especially as a young person, since I ran in 2020 and won my election and started my journey in the General Assembly in 2021, I've been the youngest state senator. I've often been the Blackest, I've been the queerest, and I have been a visibly Black woman in a space with primarily middle-aged white men. And that's not to say that I can't build relationships with my colleagues, but how I lead and the way that I lead is going to be inherently different because I'm a formerly low-income Black queer person. And all of my previous experiences inform how me and my fellow colleagues champion issues in our communities.
You grew up in Georgia. You would sometimes, a few times a month, travel hours to Carolina to attend church with your family. And determinants of health, access, this is related to where we play, where we pray, where we learn. I'm curious what role the church played in you then and now.
Church growing up was a really big part of my own family and of my own journey. And my family did travel a long way because we had a very small family church. We were Pentecostal apostolic. My mom's uncle was our pastor. Many of my cousins and extended family member also attended the same church. So Sunday was just a big event and family reunion. And I learned a lot and I felt really safe and respected, especially growing up in a low-income family. Sometimes rent wouldn't be paid, lights would be off, and there wouldn't be enough food in the fridge in order to feed me and my 4 siblings. But church was a very safe space, and we always ended, as many faith practices end, with a fellowship or with food. And so it was an extremely safe space outside of a cramped apartment with 4 siblings and a mom working paycheck to paycheck, where I was able to explore my faith and safety and safe adults who were able to give me different experiences of what was possible when I grew up, but also what it looked like to explore a world without fear of the outside. And it was also a primarily Black space. I spent a lot of that day with primarily people who looked like me, who loved like me, and who talked like me, when the days in my school didn't look like that. And so I think Sunday, especially with my family on those long car trips, and then when we were in service, was a day to really honor and respect my own Blackness and to respect my own community and really find community when 5 out of 7 days I didn't really have that.
Audience members know emergency medicine is my specialty, and now also lifestyle medicine. One of the pillars of lifestyle medicine in terms of health and prevention is community and regularly being in community. So I love that share, a foundation for you and your own health. I believe I've heard an interview where you talked a little bit about your path to politics and that advocacy and standing up did come from, or you saw it modeled a bit in your parents. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so 2008, my family had just moved to Columbia, South Carolina. My mom owned a small business in Atlanta, Georgia. The 2008 financial collapse devastated lots of businesses, including my mom's small business, where she provided free and reduced lunch for summer school programs like the Boys and Girls Club or YMCA, which me and my siblings and many of my classmates benefited from. After that, my family, who are renters, we had to move to South Carolina, where my mom's husband owned a house because the cost of living was just much cheaper to live in a house that we already owned versus living in an apartment in the Atlanta suburbs. When I moved to South Carolina, that was also the summer of Obama's first campaign. And I had never in my life seen my parents talk about, think about, or even engage in voting. But it was Obama's first campaign having a prominent Black man on the national stage saying that he was going to change our nation for the better and for people that looked like us. And my mom took me one day to the South Carolina Obama headquarters to do phone banking. And so I sat in a room with my mom over probably oranges as a snack, and we made phone calls to other residents. And I'd never had that experience before. We'd spent a lot of time in church. We'd spent a lot of time in the community. I'd spent time helping my mom assemble free and reduced lunches for kids at summer school programs, but I'd never engaged in directly talking to people. Phone banking for the first time as a 13 or 14-year-old inherently changed how I thought and how I saw myself. And I remember crying, and I think about watching my family. Again, I'd never seen engage in politics, think about voting, see voting as a tool for their own voices until that moment. And then when I was able to vote for the first time in 2012 as a freshman on Brown University's campus, I was incredibly honored and thought about those moments of being on the first campaign. Even though I couldn't vote in 2008, I was still involved in the process. And since then, I think about that journey of my mom taking her first leap of being civically engaged and bringing me and my siblings along with that, to now that I'm in office and having my family now vote in every election, ask me questions, or think about how to find who this person is or who's running for county commissioner. They don't have a county commissioner in Rhode Island, but even being able to help my family navigate those questions as an now elected official started with that journey.
Love this share, love this story. And if I can reflect on my own experience, what we see in our household really sort of informs us and it models us and it gives us messaging. I grew up in a household where actually my parents did not also discuss politics or civic health, and that sense of engagement, even that not completely stepping in and that it's a part of being a citizen and part of health. I really believe civic health is a part of health. Even in medicine, there's very much messaging about medicine's not political, healthcare is not political. You and I both know it is 100% political and it's become politicized. One more thing about education and how education can provide access. You studied and earned an IB, an International Baccalaureate. You were in orchestra. And I've heard you speak about your family's socioeconomic status, yet there was access. And that's not always the case up here in the North.
That's one of the starkest difference. So once I graduated from Brown, I actually did Teach for America and taught for 2 years at New Bedford High School. And I remember the stark differences between the education that I was charged with providing my students at the age of 22 and the same education that I got in the Atlanta suburbs. Yes, my family lived in apartments. Sometimes we couldn't afford rent. Sometimes our lights were cut off and we relied on SNAP benefits. But I knew that going into a school building, I would have a high quality education where I was supported by high quality teachers who cared about my learning. And I also had teachers that looked like me. And I think that was one of the big differences. I had my first Black teacher when I was in the second grade. I had a Black math teacher when I was in middle school. And by the time I got to high school, I felt empowered to not only feel smart, quote unquote, but I had teachers who were nurturing my interests, who were loving that I was reading 5 books at a time, who I could see myself in and who were reflecting their real and authentic selves for me. I had a challenging curriculum. I was speaking multiple languages in school. I was engaging in science in a way that my own parents didn't have access to, but I was still supported through after school programs or robust supports. And I think about that and the adults in my life, whether it was playing sports, volleyball, lacrosse, or whether it was robust school programs like orchestra, which helped me develop my identity, musicality, and develop a different part of my brain that wasn't tied to math, science, and STEM, but was creative and an outlet that most people wouldn't have access to without private lessons. I was able to get to the South Carolina Youth Philharmonic Orchestra through an audition as a violist because I had a really great and awesome high school orchestra and middle school orchestra experience where I learned how to start playing when I was 11 years old. And then I come to the New England area teaching in a school in Massachusetts where there is no orchestra program, there is no international baccalaureate program. And I was the first Black math teacher that a majority of my students had ever had. I was the first person that they saw themselves in. And that translated to my students not feeling like they were good at math, not feeling that math was relevant to their lives or that math was applicable to the work that they could see themselves doing in the long run. And so I was charged with trying to connect real life experiences. I taught social justice math, the rate of change of the imprisoned population in our country from the 1900s to 2016 through tools like the 13th. I taught the Pythagorean theorem and creating triangles by talking about the Syrian refugee crisis and how long it took some people to travel from point A to point B and eventually end up as refugees in the same communities that they were living in. And so I tried to connect these things because I saw it inherently. It wasn't a conversation. I wouldn't say that any of my teachers in middle school or in high school through the IB program taught me social justice math, but every single lesson that I had was connected to the real world. And there was an abundance of opportunities. I could see myself as a doctor. I could see myself as a lawyer. I could see myself as a researcher. I could see myself as someone who would eventually maybe get a master's or a PhD program because many of my teachers had that. And I think those were some of the stark differences that I still work to this day as a state legislator to combat.
And again, this all ties into health. And, college is the time that we get to explore ourselves, stretch our wings. You've talked about in the 6th grade signing an abstinence pledge. And then part of your growth and evolution became a sex education educator, worked for Planned Parenthood.
I think growing up in the conservative Christian South and growing up in a family that didn't really talk about sexuality, that didn't talk about sexual health. I had one conversation with my mom when I had my period, and that was kind of the end of the story. Didn't really talk about healthy relationships, didn't talk about my body or about exploring what it would look like to have an intimate partner later in life. And so to be able to be on campus and for the first time, the part of freshman orientation on campus is a comprehensive sex education class. And this was also during the height of the Me Too movement. And so there was a lot of conversations about how to keep yourself safe. And I was like, whoa, this is a lot of information for someone who is coming from the South, who is formerly low income and on a campus that I could have only dreamed of for most of my life. Many of those conversations opened up my eyes to students who came from different faith backgrounds, students who were openly agnostic, students who also came from conservative religious backgrounds, even though they weren't Christian, was eye-opening. I was like, wait, this is the only framework I know how to engage in the world, but there are so many new and different frameworks. And I also felt unprepared to have those conversations. And so I couldn't change that I was Black. I couldn't change that I was low income, but I could change how I navigated conversations about my body, around my own freedom, and how I explored those openly on this campus. And so that took me to, well, I can't change that I never learned sex ed, but I can make it to where no other students don't have access to information about their bodies.
Growth mindset, Senator Mack, growth mindset. And I just resonate because different women, different experiences, but I grew up in small town Rhode Island. And so small town, predominantly Catholic, conservative. When I went to college, all of a sudden, I too was confronted with lots of conversations, lots of discussions that I was like, this has never been talked about in my household, or this is interesting. And I loved it. I also had that game on growth mindset. Let me see. I'm going to see how I feel about this. And I would much rather be exposed than not and come to my own conclusions. And I truly feel that this has made you an even more effective voice and politician. And I know it made me a much more effective physician and basically patient facing, able to have conversations that otherwise I wouldn't be as patient centered and caring and health oriented. You started getting involved, something called the Rhode Island Political Cooperative that I believe now has dissolved. And I mentioned in the intro that you challenged the 30-year incumbent and you won 60% of the vote. How did you actually, do you think, win over, convince, be in community with your 20,000 constituents that said, yeah, I want Senator Mack?
This is one of my favorite stories. And I think this story is going to be more common the next few years because I was 25 years old when someone said, you should run for office. And I said, absolutely not. I've got tattoos, I've got yellow hair and a potty mouth. And I am on Twitter way too much talking about what I do outside of my traditional 9 to 5. And I didn't see myself in politics. And similar to my experience going to Brown, I didn't see people who look like me and I didn't see people who had stories like mine. But I knew that the person who represented me didn't represent the communities that I wanted to be in. And so I was praying that someone else would raise their hand to run against this incumbent. And when that didn't happen, I said, well, I guess it's me. And part of why I ran and part of why I lead so fiercely is because I know the challenge of when you have someone who doesn't represent you and they are an obstacle to a pathway to seeing yourself in your community, to your livelihood, and to the host of opportunities that you have access to, it can feel defeating. And I was running on the tail end of the first Trump presidency, and I had graduated in 2016 in June. And by November, the world had fundamentally changed and what I thought was possible had fundamentally changed. I was working in a school and I remember crying after the November election and coming into a group of 9th and 10th graders who were like, well, why are you devastated? This doesn't change anything. And I had to tell them, this changes everything. And for the next 4 years, I was in the community on the ground. I was fighting for abortion rights right before the overturning of Roe versus Wade. I was fighting for access to immigrants to have the same healthcare coverage and access to opportunities in our community. And when I saw that there was someone who'd been in that office and who was comfortable being in that office for 30 years, but wasn't fighting for those issues as if it was life or death, or as if they didn't see those same young faces hungry for change, or who didn't understand that the world that they were inheriting was not the world that I thought I was inheriting when I was their age, broke me. And so I knew that I had to run for office and I had to say yes to that call, even though I didn't see myself being in there. I could talk to more people and I could use my story and my frustration to get people to see that you don't have to be angry. You have to be elected. You don't have to be angry. You have to be involved. You don't have to be angry, but you do have to meet and talk to the people who are in charge of the decisions in order to get them to see how their consequences or how their lack of action does have consequences.
It's graduation season, and guess what? There's a perfect gift for anyone taking their next big step. It's called Microskills, Small Actions, Big Impact, co-authored by Dr. Resa E. Lewis. This book breaks down success into specific intentional behaviors that anyone can develop, whether you're a student entering the workforce or simply wanting to improve your daily interactions, and who wouldn't want to do that? These evidence-based techniques will transform how you communicate and present yourself. What makes this book so special is that it doesn't offer generic advice. It provides actionable resources that make a real difference in all aspects of your life. Available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook formats wherever you get your books. And if you're looking to bring microskills to your organization or student group, reach out to Dr. Lewis directly via LinkedIn or through her website. Remember, microskills, your go-to graduation gift that keeps on giving throughout life's journey.
Quote, growing up, I didn't see many people who looked like me in politics. I never knew that I could have a voice in the decisions that shaped the fight for quality education, clean air, food, and healthy communities. I want to use my story and my experience to dare to dream. So, when did you realize you had a voice, and when did you start using this voice?
I think I realized I had a voice when I was in undergrad. So I got connected to Planned Parenthood after teaching sex ed. And I did a summer policy and advocacy internship in 2014, where I worked on Rhode Island campaigns for the 2014 legislative cycle all throughout the state, leading phone banking, leading postcarding, and leading canvassing in the community. And similar to my experience doing phone banking in 2008, I was like, well, what is this world? Who are these people that I'm talking to? Who are these elected officials that I'm talking about? I'm in this quote unquote blue bubble, but it doesn't represent everything that I've read in books and everything that's represented on TV. And there were folks who had ideals that I didn't feel matched up with this progressive platform that the Northeast Corridor had kind of built itself as. I realized I had a voice navigating that landscape and going to the state house. I was in the state house in 2019 when Rhode Island passed the right to choose and codifying Roe versus Wade in our state law. I was in the state house testifying in front of these committees, and I was reading my speeches, and I was in front of a panel of the Senate Judiciary and the House Judiciary Committee with people who didn't look like me and who didn't know my stories. And as a young woman of reproductive age, talking to a majority cast of characters who could never get pregnant or who had had their children at a much different point in American history, I knew that I had to tell more stories about me, about my body, and about people who looked like me. I can never give someone else a voice, but I can give voice to my community and to my stories. And I think since then, I haven't stopped talking and I haven't stopped using that voice.
You've talked about people-centered communities, and I'm a big fan of something called human-centered design, where you have the end user at the table helping to design the policy, the law, the medical practice. How do you try to make sure that people are at the center of your legislation, of your Instagram, of your politicking?
Yeah, so I can talk about my journey through maternal health. I got involved again through my work with sexual health and reproductive health through internships with Planned Parenthood and eventually to being an advocate in the community with a group of doulas and professional midwives and birth workers who kind of welcomed me with open arms into this world of Black maternal health. And this was in 2016, well before I even knew that I would become Senator Mack, where I was learning about a maternal health crisis from people who were on the front lines doing something called doula work. And I studied public health, and so I knew about the Black maternal health crisis, but I'd never seen the Black maternal health crisis. I'd only read about it in books and in articles. My mother had given birth to 5 children, and she had a relatively uneventful birthing experience for all of those. My grandmother also had relatively uneventful birthing experiences, and I didn't know anyone who was impacted by the Black maternal health crisis. And it was coming to Rhode Island and being embraced by this group of maternal health workers where I heard stories and I saw the people who were on the front lines of these communities bearing all. And it was hearing how policy could change what was possible for people who looked like me. And as a young Black woman who eventually sees myself as a mother and who aims to give birth one day, I couldn't imagine giving birth knowing that something could go wrong and that there would be no tools at my disposal. But I was embraced by a community that said, legislation is possible. And so in 2017, I started working on the Rhode Island doula bill as an advocate with this group of doulas before I was even in office. My first year in office in 2021, we passed the Rhode Island doula bill, becoming a pioneering state and having doula Medicaid reimbursements for doula services in our state. And since then, I've worked on certifying lactation counselors, licensing of lactation counselors, and a host of other maternal health bills. And this has all been in conjunction with that same community. I joke with my friend who I work with, who now runs a birthing center, that we've been in this work now since 2016 together. So it's been a minute. It's almost been 10 years. And that is all due to their leadership and their work and their community building. And that legislation would not be possible if it wasn't for their voice and their community building alongside me before I was even Senator Mack.
Such a beautiful illustration, human-centered design, and a relevant quote, laws are our values written down.
Yes. I love to lead with that, especially at a time where there's a crisis at the national level. Budgets are moral documents. Every single piece of legislation that I introduce, even if I know it is not going to pass, is a statement of my values. I think particularly of the voter ID laws. Rhode Island does not have an appetite in this current political moment to change our voter ID laws. We're one of 14 states, I believe, that have active voter ID laws. And I introduce that piece of legislation year after year because I know my values are that any barrier to someone's access to their voice, which is their vote, is a hindrance on how they engage in their communities.
Yeah. Your voice is visible on Instagram. And I'm wondering how you think social media does play a role in the effectiveness of your voice and how you actually are strategic in using social media.
Yeah. So I also like to say that I am unapologetically me always. I've gone viral for having a joyful twerk on the beach in Rhode Island on Block Island. But I also use my social media to show that I am not perfect. I do not have all the answers, but to model what it looks like to lead. I never imagined myself being in office as a career politician, and I want other people to see what it looks like to be a natural haired girly with tattoos and sometimes with glasses or sometimes in pajamas or sometimes on my mental health walk around my community. What does it look like to lead and how can I lead? And to also demystify what it looks like to be in office. I only imagined people in office as always wearing suits and being stuffy and speaking in legalese. I have not had that experience and my leadership has been questioned, but I think it is unquestionable that I lead with a fierce authenticity. And that's not to say that you can't be buttoned up, if you can't be an introvert, you can't be more reserved. But I want people to see different leadership styles, the same way that I grew up seeing that an abundance of worlds and possibilities and professions was possible. I want people to also see that there's an abundance of leadership styles that are possible. And also, being a young person who knows how to use my front facing camera and TikTok and Instagram goes a long way. And sometimes I'm on trend with some of the memes, and sometimes I'm on trend with some of the ways that people engage, but I want to meet people where they are. I never saw politicians who reached out in a quick burst or who broke down information in bite-sized pieces. And so I want to model what that could look like.
May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And correct me if I'm wrong, you're in the final weeks of the 2025 legislative session for the state of Rhode Island. What does success look like to you?
Oh, that is a great question. And I think the metrics of success change. We're in unprecedented times at the national level where funding to key programs is under threat, whether it's Medicaid, SNAP benefits, or states that might potentially have to pull their fair share. I want to make sure that communities that look like mine, who are going to be the most impacted and who are often the most overlooked and whose data most people will look at and say, that's so sad, but won't know the human stories behind it, are protected. And so whether it is encouraging our state to increase revenue in the form of taxing the top 1% of tax filers in our state so that we have an additional $190 million to invest in potential Medicaid cuts or to invest in potential SNAP benefit cuts is a priority. I also want to protect renters, even if we are moving the needle just 1 degree or just one blip to the left, that is a win. And right now we are in the Rhode Island General Assembly, folks who are willing to kind of push the needle a little bit more to the left are in a minority, but I think our success will come with shifting the conversation to we cannot end this session without at least protecting a small portion of people, even if it costs no money and even if it is a Hail Mary in the dark. It is our duty, it is our responsibility to fight for a chance to win.
Rhode Island State Congress and your position as a state senator, it's not a full time. And so audience members may not know the specifics of the way Rhode Island works. Can you just break that down?
Yes, Rhode Island is a part-time legislative assembly. We typically meet Tuesdays and Thursdays in the Rhode Island Senate after 4 p.m. and we go until whenever committees are done. I also sit on a committee that meets on Wednesdays and we start at also 4 p.m. Through those periods of time, we hear pieces of legislation and we work on those in committee to pass on to the floor. We also are in our communities. I have hosted a Tax the 1% teach-in where we explain the budget process. We typically end the legislative session once the budget is passed by our Constitution. We have to pass a budget by July 1st of every year because our fiscal year ends on June 30th. We typically end about 2 weeks before then. And so once that is all nice and wrapped up and we have spent $14 billion to keep the state running for another year, we kind of pack it up and go home until January of the next year.
If you could pick 3 things, personal or professional, what would you like to accomplish in the next year?
Oh, that is a great question. I would like to protect tenants in the form of more robust eviction protections, just cause evictions, and increasing our ability to seal evictions. I'd also like to strengthen our healthcare programs for the most vulnerable moms and perinatal moms by increasing access to certified professional midwife coverage and certified lactation or licensed certified lactation counselor coverage. And another goal would be to read more.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Being a visible voice, being present, being a politician, fighting for communities, it's really important that we take care of our own health. You take care of your own health. And I want to make sure we give a hat tip to the role that rugby plays in your life, as well as crocheting and other aspects of self-care. Tell us what you do.
Yes, well, I often joke that I play rugby because I can't hit my colleagues, but I can hit willing participants. And rugby has been a big part of my life for the last 13, almost 14 years. I started playing as a freshman on Brown's campus, and I haven't stopped playing since. This is my last weekend of 15s rugby with the New England Rugby Championships that I'll be going to with my team. It's a bunch of joy and it's a really great release. It makes me feel powerful. It makes me feel strong and it makes me feel connected. And it's a way to get outside, even in cold weather, in rainy weather, the worst weather days. We call those rugby days. It's foggy, it's raining, and it's like 30 degrees. And we joke that that's rugby weather. I also do love to crochet. I'm working on a few crochet projects. I don't really have a goal of when I'll end, but I'm always making a little something and keeping my hands moving. I think mental health, especially in this work, as much as I love to embrace joy, this work will break your heart and rebuild it over and over again. But it is with a fierce optimism that I know that we are working towards change. And every step is one step closer to change. It might be circuitous. All of the work that we do leads towards justice. And I want to make sure that I'm fueled for that work ahead. And so keeping my joy and not letting the world take that away, because they don't want us to lead with joy. Whoever they is, the big nefarious science fiction, they don't want us to have joy, and they will try to take that away at every moment. But I'm able to do this work because I fundamentally believe that we should have communities that are built and centered around joy, kind of like that human design.
I've mentioned that you and I both love books. Let's see. Growing up, you read Gossip Girl. You and I have both connected on Carson McCullers. You like Afrofuturism as well as sci-fi fantasy, including authors such as Octavia Butler. Tell us about the role books play for you. How have books helped you imagine a world that can be better than what we have now?
I overwhelmingly believe that books are our framework, and science fiction and fantasy are the frameworks for how we build a better world. Some of my favorite books, whether about magicians or a race of people that we've never seen, goblins, ghouls, vampires, or new creatures that an author is creating, lay out a framework. We can more clearly see injustice. And it was just recently, May the 4th be with you. And I love Star Wars, and I love seeing the world that George Lucas is able to create through that series, because we can clearly see who are the bad guys. We can clearly see injustice, and we can clearly see what is wrong when it is multiple worlds away, light years away. But we sometimes cannot come down to earth or come out of the pages to see injustice when it is staring us in the face and when it is bearing its ugly soul in front of our lives and playing out in the everyday. And so I love books because I've been able to see, what does it look like to imagine a world where everyone is equal? What does it look like to imagine a world where a young magician doesn't have to struggle to pay his tuition to magician school? What does it look like to have a post-apocalyptic world navigating, creating a new religion and planting seeds for people to understand that the change might not be now in this moment that we're living in, but I'm building a future for my grandchildren, for my grandchildren's children. And what seeds am I laying and planting now?
Senator Mack, a mint conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast. For audience members that want to follow you, your work, and your voice, what's the best way to check you out?
I am at Mack District 6 on all social media platforms, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. I also have a website, Tiara Mack District 6, and an email list that you can follow.
The Resa wrap-up. Special thanks to Senator Tiara Mack for joining me in conversation. Audience health. A big piece of health and engagement in society is civic health. So understanding the legislative process is crucial for civic engagement. Next, leadership. Self-care is essential for effective leadership, and there are many ways to do self-care. Tiara shared about her playing rugby, crocheting, and reading books. And what I really love about her share regarding books is that books can inspire and provide a framework for change, a framework for a better world. That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Please find me through my website and on social media, Resa E. Lewis, MD, or through the podcast, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please be sure to share the show with a friend. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the institution with which they are affiliated or identified. Information herein should never be used as a substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice.